Food fraud in a global context. The recent release of the World Trade Organization's report on illicit trade in food and food fraud inspired me to create a back-to-basics overview of the current global situation with food fraud. In this post, I'll talk about the costs of food fraud and who bears those costs, definitions of food fraud, and global prevention and enforcement strategies. Costs of food fraud. Food fraud is estimated to cost between 30 and 50 billion US dollars per year globally, excluding trade in illicit alcoholic beverages. Illicit alcoholic beverages cost US dollars 8.9 billion annually in lost revenue. And in the email and the post, I've got the global trade values of frequently affected commodities, such as meat, seafood, coffee, milk, etc., in the billions of dollars, each of them. So there's some new data there. And the sum of those values, excluding alcohol, is $438 billion, which puts the percentage value of the fraud, which is $30 to $50 billion, at 7 to 11%. So that's right, around 10% of our global food system, by those figures, is affected by food fraud. Here is my comment on this. 10% seems a good estimate to me for an activity that is, by its very nature, impossible to measure. It's rare for any survey which explores the authenticity of a food to find fraud levels lower than 10%, unless there have been recent enforcement actions in the same commodity and market. For example, Côte d'Ivoire's cocoa industry lost about 125,000 tonnes of cocoa to smuggling in the 2017 growing season, equivalent to 9% of its harvest. So that's close to 10%. Similarly, the losses estimated from illicit trade in alcoholic beverages comes to around 9% of the global value of the global trade. Who pays these costs and losses? The costs of food fraud are borne by many organisations and groups from the food system, including legitimate businesses, government-funded organisations, and consumers. The nature of the costs borne by each are listed below. Legitimate businesses, they lose because of loss of sales, so that's a direct cost, and loss of sales through lowering of consumer confidence. Governments, they get a loss of revenue from tax evasion, for example, from the smuggling of foods or beverages across borders, thereby avoiding duties and taxes. Governments also bear the cost of enforcement actions. Governments and citizens subject to healthcare costs from illnesses and injuries from fraudulently adulterated food. Consumers bear the costs of healthcare costs from illnesses and injuries, loss of income and other indirect costs from illnesses and injuries, loss of money from purchasing fraud-affected products, and loss of trust in the food system. Definitions of food fraud. There's no globally agreed definition of food fraud. The Food and Agriculture Organization's Codex Alimentarius, the Food Commission, has been working to create one for some years now. The World Trade Organization didn't attempt to create its own definition for the purposes of the report, despite seeing itself as having a pivotal role in the global prevention of illicit trade in food. Below are a list of food fraud definitions. So I'll read them out. The Transnational Alliance to Combat Illicit Trade calls food fraud the intentional substitution or dilution of an authentic food or ingredient with a cheaper product, or the adding of unapproved substances or substitution of one species with another. Apparently, their definition also includes the smuggling of agricultural products, and I've got a link, of course, or a reference to that definition in the email and the post. The United States FDA says that economically motivated adulteration occurs when someone intentionally leaves out, takes out, or substitutes a valuable ingredient or part of a food, or when someone adds a substance to a food to make it appear better or of greater value. The European Union considers food fraud to be a suspected intentional action by businesses or individuals for the purpose of deceiving purchasers and gaining undue advantage therefrom in violation of the rules referred to in Article 1, brackets 2 of Regulation EU 2017/625. And the most popular academic definition is by Spink and Moyer from 2011. Food fraud is a collective term used to encompass the deliberate or intentional substitution, addition, tampering, or misrepresentation of food ingredients, or food packaging, or false or misleading statements made about a product for economic gain. Comment. Food fraud definitions have been a source of almost constant academic discussion since I started working in food fraud in 2015. Definitions are used to describe the scope of studies, surveys and databases, and each of these will look quite different depending on the definition used. For example, the European Commission's monthly reports on EU agri-food fraud suspicions contains hundreds of notifications related to too high pesticides or unauthorised pesticide residues in fruit and vegetables imported to European countries. Is every one of these notifications linked to a case of deliberate fraud? Unlikely. In many of these cases, an accidental violation is at least as likely as a deliberate fraud. Perhaps the farmer used improper pesticide practices or used a pesticide allowed in their country but banned in Europe without knowing the crop would be sent to Europe. Or perhaps the trader was unaware of the differences in pesticide rules from country to country. These would be accidental violations that could be included in the EU food fraud reports. On the other hand, some traders might decide to try their luck with produce they know could be non-compliant on the hope that they aren't caught, and that would be fraud. This brings us to the second issue with defining food fraud, the legal and enforcement perspective. In fraud law generally, not just food fraud, a person can usually only be successfully prosecuted for fraud if they can be shown to have had intent. That is, if they intended to defraud their victim. Creating a food fraud definition that would require enforcement agencies to show evidence about the intention or the private thoughts of a food trader could be counterproductive. The fear is that if the definition is not good enough, some perpetrators may be excused on a legal loophole. Note that the United Kingdom's Food Crime Unit has avoided these challenges by using the term food crime and avoiding the term food fraud in its public-facing information. My favourite definition of food fraud is not mentioned in the WTO report. It is, food fraud is deception using food for economic gain, and that is by Spink et al. 2016. Are new definitions and new laws needed to fight food fraud? Until recently, media outlets and commentators discussing major food fraud events would almost always call for tougher laws to catch food fraud perpetrators. Food academics and criminologists would call for better definitions. Those days are over. The WTO report doesn't mention the creation of new laws, nor suggests that new definitions are needed. Current laws are suitable. It's been illegal to defraud your customers and associates and to evade taxes by smuggling since the earliest days of criminal law. Food purity, safety and wholesomeness laws have been in place since the 19th century at least in most countries. Contract law prevents trading partners from willfully supplying goods that do not meet agreed standards. These are the laws with which food crimes are pursued. In its report, the WTO mentions that it provides a legal framework so that countries, can enforce their trade laws. The two main legal frameworks are the WTO's Agreement on the Application of Sanitary and Phytosanitary Measures and the Agreement on Technical Barriers to Trade. The Codex Alimentarius Commission also has a Code of Ethics for International Trade in Food from 1979, which states that international trade in food should be conducted on the principle that all consumers are entitled to safe, sound and wholesome food and to protection from unfair trade practices, and that food which is unsafe, deceptively labelled or past its expiry date should not be in international trade. How should the global system deal with food fraud? Prevention is better than cure, says the WTO report. The report also calls for more cross-border cooperation in the investigation and enforcement of food crimes. Operation Opson is a joint operation of Europol and Interpol which targets fake and substandard food and beverages. It's in its 12th year and each year results in hundreds of tonnes of food and drinks being removed from commerce and dozens of enforcement actions such as prosecutions and fines. Other notable cross-border anti-food fraud operations include last year's honey enforcement action in Europe, called From the Hives, in which 16 EU member states plus Switzerland and Norway tested a total of 320 consignments of honey imported from 20 countries. The results prompted a number of enforcement actions, and the operation has been followed by new rules for honey traceability and honey origin information for consumers in Europe, colloquially known as the Breakfast Directive. Comment. While there are sufficient laws to make food fraud illegal, the way that enforcement agencies understand the scope of food fraud activities and the degree of importance they place on investigating and prosecuting such crimes varies widely from place to place. For example, an organised crime investigation unit might see that a crime group they're investigating is selling illicit olive oil, but might not have the resources to trace the oil back to its original source. Similarly, they might not understand the danger such oil poses to consumers. The food industry has created initiatives to help share information about potentially fraud-affected ingredients and products and provide resources to legitimate food businesses. These include the Food Authenticity Network and the Food Industry Intelligence Network. Vulnerabilities which allow illegal food trade to flourish. When it comes to illicit international trade in food and beverages, there are many regions of the world that are particularly vulnerable for the following reasons: the lack of legal enforcement activities, weak border controls, long and porous borders between countries, which allows for cross-border smuggling, weak enforcement within borders, informal supply chains, and consumer demand for cheap food. Takeaways for food professionals. Food fraud is more prevalent and more costly than many people imagine, affecting approximately 10% of the global food supply. Most food fraud goes undetected and unreported. Some food fraud reports, however, include large numbers of notifications that could be the result of accidental violations rather than intentional fraud activities, such as pesticide residue violations in the European Commission's Food Fraud Suspicion Reports. Information sharing and laboratory expertise have improved since 2015 with better resources available to food businesses, including from the Food Authenticity Network and its list of expert laboratories, which they call Centres of Excellence. The Food Authenticity Network and the Food Industry Intelligence Network are recommended for legitimate businesses that wish to protect their consumers and brands from the impact of food fraud. In short, we don't have hard data on the cost of food fraud, but estimates put the value at between US $30 billion to $50 billion per year globally. I estimate that around 10% of the global food supply is affected by food fraud. The costs are borne by legitimate businesses, governments, and consumers. Definitions of food fraud vary from country to country, and there's no global legal definition. Current laws are sufficient to tackle food fraud, however, enforcement is challenging, even in wealthy countries. Industry initiatives, including the Food Authenticity Network and the Food Industry Intelligence Network, have valuable resources and information sharing systems for food businesses. And unless I've linked otherwise in the email and the post, all sources in this post are from Chapter 1 of the World Trade Organization's report on illicit trade in food and food fraud. And Chapter 1 is by Doa Abdelmotal, who is the Senior Counselor at the WTO's Agriculture and Commodities Division.